Welcome to today's flying kayak explanation video. The topic for today's flying kayak explanation video is automatic aircraft landings, or what happens when an aircraft lands using only the autopilot. In this video, we'll talk about what exactly an auto land actually is and how an auto land works, what systems are at play, what ground-based systems are required, and what does the pilot and the autopilot have to do to land the aircraft automatically. In the final part of this video, we'll take a look at what exactly it looks like when you land a 737-700 simulation automatically. What exactly is autoland? When we refer to autoland, we mean that an aircraft is being landed automatically by its autopilot with no human intervention during the landing. So the aircraft more or less lands itself. This aids the pilot when he lands in a few very special conditions. For example, if there's very low visibility, what happens is that the pilot cannot react fast enough when he sees the runway. So the computer takes over. As the computer doesn't rely on eyesight to know where the runway is, it can perform the necessary actions early enough and fast enough to land the aircraft safely, even in low visibility. This of course reduces delays or flight cancellations due to bad weather. However, this does require very complex aircraft systems and ground-based systems that are mostly only found on airliners and at major airfields, so at international airports or on airliners like the Airbus A320 or larger. How exactly does an autoland system actually work? Basically, the autopilot interprets signals from a ground-based station and the aircraft's onboard sensors and guides the aircraft to a safe and normal landing using this information. In a normal landing, we've got three distinct phases that I've marked here in this schematic drawing. The green bit is our little aircraft, and the aircraft is currently starting the red part, which is the final approach. During the final approach, the aircraft lines up with the runway centerline and descends at a set vertical speed down a glide path. Once the aircraft reaches the runway threshold, or gets close to the runway threshold, the yellow part starts. The yellow part is known as the flare. In this part, the pilot cushions the descent by pulling back on the stick slightly, or the autopilot cushions the descent automatically, in order to make for a soft and safe touchdown. This usually occurs about 50 feet above the ground, something that is recognized by the pilot's eyesight when the pilot is flying, or by the radar altimeter, which works very similar to a sonar system on boats in an automatic landing. After touchdown, we enter the so-called rollout phase. During the rollout phase, the aircraft will decelerate, either automatically or by manual pilot braking, and it will maintain the runway centerline, either automatically or by pilot control input. But how exactly does the aircraft's autopilot, or in low visibility the aircraft's pilot, actually follow the glide path and align itself with the runway centerline? What you can see in front of you right now is a graphic display of the so-called instrument landing system. This system consists of a radio transmitter that's located at the edge of the runway threshold, and that sends out two radio beacon signals. One that offers vertical guidance, known as the glide slope signal, and one that offers lateral guidance, known as the localizer. The vertical guidance system sends out a signal that modulates across its band throughout the altitude range the aircraft could be in, and sends a very specific signal at the exact point where the aircraft is at the perfect altitude or perfect glide slope to approach the runway. The aircraft's instruments can receive and interpret this signal, allowing the autopilot to follow this perfect radio signal line all the way down to the runway threshold. The localizer works very similarly. It just works in a lateral direction, meaning that the frequency of the signal is varied along a broad side, and the autopilot will follow the perfect signal frequency that is associated with the center of the runway, or the center line, all the way down to the runway. This is done in order to offer high precision even if the pilot cannot actually see the runway and has to use the instrument landing system. But how exactly is safety ensured during this process? Safety is ensured by several autopilots being engaged. Usually that's a minimum of 3 different autopilots, or 3 different computers. Each of these computers formulates its own decision depending on sensor data and the data it receives from the ILS system on what the aircraft should do next. Usually, of course, if all autopilots work correctly, then this decision is identical for all 3 autopilots. Then these autopilots submit their decision, and the decision is executed if all 3 autopilots decide identically. If one of the autopilots were to fail during the approach, then the decision would no longer be identical. One of the autopilots would provide a different decision. The other 2 autopilots, however, would still provide identical decisions, leading to those 2 autopilots overruling the third failed autopilot, thus allowing a safe continuation of the auto-land process. Should 2 of the autopilots fail, however, this is a very different story. Then, the single autopilot would no longer have a voting system, and that means that the autopilots will all 3 disengage and thus allow for the pilot to continue a manual landing. A dual autopilot failure situation is recognized by all 3 autopilots, or at least 2 of the autopilots providing different decisions and thus obviously providing false decisions. Before we start the practical part, let's just have a very quick look at the primary flight display of a Boeing 737. What you can see right in front of you is a primary flight display of a Boeing 737. In the center of the primary flight display, you'll find the attitude indicator. The attitude indicator displays the aircraft's attitude relative to the horizon. The white central line is the horizon. The brown part symbolizes the ground, or the area below the horizon, and the blue part symbolizes the sky. You can see how far your aircraft is tilted up and down, or how far your aircraft is tilted to the side, known as bank angle. To the sides of these primary flight display attitude indicators, you'll find 2 bands, one vertical and one horizontal band, with purple diamonds on these bands. The purple diamonds represent the runway centerline in the horizontal band and the perfect glide path in the vertical band. If that perfect glide path is exactly the glide path of the aircraft, the purple diamond will be centered on the white line in the middle of the band on the vertical side, and if it's on the perfect runway centerline, then the purple diamond will be centered exactly on the white band in the center of the horizontal band. This is therefore a visual indication of the ILS system. In the top of the primary flight display, you can see the so-called autopilot mode annunciators. On the right side, you'll see the vertical mode annunciator, indicating what mode is currently governing the vertical decision-making of the autopilot. In the center, you can see the lateral mode annunciator, indicating what mode is currently governing the lateral decision-making of the autopilot. And on the very left side, you'll see the speed mode annunciator, indicating what speed mode is currently governing autopilot decision-making. This will be important when we talk about it in the video later. Also, you have your standard primary flight instruments displaying the airspeed on the left, the altitude on the right, the heading on the bottom, and the vertical speed on the far right of the primary flight display. Welcome aboard our 737-700. Now we're going to fly an auto-land approach, and we'll start by arming the auto-land mode on the autopilot and trying to intercept the localizer and glide slope signals. Let's take a closer look at the primary flight display once we've armed the auto-land system. Now that we've armed the auto-land system, below the heading mode, that is our current lateral mode, and the vertical speed mode, that is our current vertical mode, which maintains the heading and the vertical speed, now 2 modes are armed, that is, they appear in white small letters below the active modes in green. The first mode, the lateral mode that is armed, is the localizer mode, the VOR LOC mode. The LOC stands for localizer, and this mode maintains the localizer once we've intercepted it. That means once we've crossed the localizer signal the first time, the autopilot is going to capture it and follow it. Then, as a vertical mode, we have the glide slope or GS mode activated, which will similarly maintain the glide slope once we've crossed it once and captured the glide slope signal. In the next step, we've intercepted the localizer and soon will intercept the glide slope. At this point, let's take another look at our primary flight display. As we can see, the VOR LOC or localizer capture mode that offers lateral guidance along the extended runway centerline, as well as the glide slope or GS mode that offers vertical guidance all the way down to the runway, are now green. That means that they are active. Also, as you can see, the two purple diamonds have turned fully purple and are close to the center lines of their respective instruments, meaning that we're very close to the extended runway centerline and the ideal glide slope. Also, in the middle, we can now see a single channel or a single CH indication in yellow. This indicates that autoland is active. However, we have only turned on one of our two autopilot channels. In order to make sure that we can achieve a safe automatic landing, we'll have to turn on the second autopilot channel in just a second, which will then activate the voting system that allows for a safe automatic landing all the way down to the runway. Now, as we're turning onto the localizer, I can activate the second autopilot channel. The Boeing 737 has two autoflight channels, each of which consists of several autopilot computers, which all have a voting system. This is why we can use two channels to ensure a safe automatic landing. Although the second channel has been activated, the primary flight display still shows single channel. This is because the second autopilot channel will only become active in the voting system once the autoflight system has performed a self-check as a specific altitude above ground is reached. This self-check will be indicated with blinking purple diamonds in the localizer and glide slope indicator, and the entire primary flight display switching from single channel to a green Land 3 indication. Just now you can see the self-test start, and then the autopilot mode will change from single channel to a Land 3 indication. In a moment, we'll take another closer look at the primary flight display when it's finally configured for the final phase of landing. In this close-up of the primary flight display, you can now see that beneath the localizer and glide slope modes, rollout and flare are active. They will come active at 50 feet radar altitude, which is indicated by the number in the bottom of the attitude indicator, and will then guide the airplane during rollout on the runway, and for the flare, that is the cushioning of descent right before touchdown. Also, in the center of the primary flight display, you can see a Land 3 indication, which indicates that the pilot has now configured the autopilot correctly for an automatic landing. In just a second, first the flare mode of the autopilot is going to activate when we're 50 feet above the runway, and then the rollout mode of the aircraft is going to activate upon touchdown. After that, the aircraft will smoothly land on the runway centerline and start its automatic deceleration to a stop. This is the end of an automatic landing, performed entirely under autopilot control. Such a landing is incredibly important in order to provide safe operations even in the worst possible weather conditions. Alright, and with our successful landing, that will be the conclusion of today's flying kayak explanation video. What are automatic landings? I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope I could teach you something new about the interesting world of aviation. All my sources for this video are in the description below. If I got you interested, check out my Instagram at FlyingKayak, subscribe to my YouTube channel, or check out my blog at flyingkayak.home.blog. Please keep in mind that I am not a real-world pilot or flight instructor. Do not use this video or any other content on my YouTube, my Instagram, my Wattpad, or my blog for real-world aviation purposes. My videos are intended for flight simulation purposes and entertainment only.